All right. Ray, why don't you succinctly repeat what it is we're going to discuss here?
Well, if you want succinct, you should have given me a little heads up that I was going to start by saying something succinct, but here goes.
All right, elaborate.
I suggested on the thread maybe that we consider the central truth that God is love, because for as massive a truth as that is, I think it gets a little too much short shrift in the church. I've been a little amazed at the number of times over the years in a class when I asked the class, okay, you've got 20 minutes, 25 minutes, you're in a coffee shop with someone who wants to know about God, and you've only got a few minutes to tell them everything you know about God. Where are you going to start? And of course, it always takes a few minutes. You can see the wheels turning in everybody's head, and you invariably get answers. At least I invariably got answers like, oh, the righteousness of God, the holiness of God, the power of God, the coming judgment of God. And it usually takes a little while for someone to kind of, raise their hand as God is love. And yeah, and then that's the launch point for the discussion. I heard Billy's uncle once say one time in a Pepperdine lecture years ago, or maybe it was one of his books, I lose track, but ask a Jewish faithful from the Old Testament, why did God create? And he would say, because he loves. And then he talks about Psalm 136, all that creation language, the creation statements echoing Genesis 1, punctuated by, for his loving kindness is everlasting, for his loving kindness is everlasting. In terms of what kind of implications that has for me as an individual, or for us as a church, as in terms of our identity, and in terms of emphasis for evangelism, how should we evangelize? It seems to me that should be the linchpin that we maybe start with, and upon which everything hangs. And so those are some of the thoughts I had. I thought it might be worthwhile to discuss amongst ourselves and see what everyone else thinks about it. One of the most brilliant illustrations I ever heard of Pepperdine was from Scott McKnight, an Anglican teacher, one of N.T. Wright's colleagues and friends. And he taught college, I think, for 20, 30 years. And he said the problem with our plan of salvation classes and discussions is that when you emphasize hear, believe, repent, confess, and be baptized, or the one true marks of the church, or responding to an invitation, is you wind up with a salvation culture, and that's the wrong kind of culture. In teaching students, what he did first year with all of his students is he had kind of a Trivial Pursuit test, 327 questions about Jesus they handed out. And by the end of the year or semester, everyone had that completed, all questions answered. And the reason he would do that is because it was the best way to get them to open the Gospels and spend all this time in the Gospels reading about Jesus. By the time they'd answered all 327 questions, they had fallen in love with Jesus. He said, when people respond to an invitation or say a sinner's prayer or respond because they, can't take one more verse of just as I am, upwards of 90% or 80% of youngsters that respond in that way don't have anything to do with God by the time they're in their 30s. But his experience with his students who fell in love with Jesus because he spent so much time in the Gospels had a lot higher percentage, was his experience. So I thought that was pretty amazing. So anyway, I just thought that would be a worthwhile subject to put our minds to on a morning.
All right.
I don't know how succinct that was, but.
And not succinct at all. But for you, probably a 7 out of 10. I had written down here in my notes, ask Ray to be succinct, give him about 45 minutes.
Did you say 45 or 42?
Yeah, 45. Well, I think you raised pretty much 2 points there. The idea of what it means in the first
Well,
place.
3 points if you're listening, Billy. Implications for my own personal life, implications for church life, and implications for evangelism.
Yeah, I heard none of those. I only heard my only two. I only hear my own points.
We thought then.
Don't come in here running with your own thoughts and your own points. I've already got mine settled in my head.
I'll shut up now.
You think you are running in here with your own opinions? Billy, send them some Galaxy. But what all right. What I heard was the definition, what it means to begin with, and then there's something else that I've been thinking about myself recently, that if we this salvation culture, the idea that if we're selling God on an individual basis, then surely we run the risk of filling the church full of narcissists, interested only in themselves and what's in it for me. Whereas if we promote God as a lover of the world, that's a whole different ballgame. It's what he's doing for us, the human family, of which I belong and therefore I benefit. But yeah, that's my initial. That's what I heard you say. So before we discuss it, I just wanted to make sure I heard what you were saying.
Yeah, that's true. And also, the way we have shaped and formed our concept of the gospel, which is salvation and being restored to God because our sins separate us from him, which isn't really the core of the gospel at all. But the way we present that is designed to facilitate or pressure you into a decision, which is one of the reasons we've, in the last 150 years, preached so much hellfire and brimstone, because it helps facilitate a decision, which is not even the best motivation for a decision. But again, that gets back to self and fear, etc. As opposed to the gospel, what really is the good news that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and he is the Messiah, which is a different emphasis. So.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because I'll tell you, as I think about my years in ministry and the way people respond to what we're calling the gospel and the God is love and these kinds of messages, unless they're predisposed to give God a pass, God doesn't come across as love in this message that says, look, here's the point. You better do what he says, or he's going to put you in a torture chamber forever and ever and ever and ever and ever, and never stop torturing you. And so you better do what he says. That does not come across as God so loved the world that he gave his one. And the world he loved was a sinful world. God so loved a sinful world, a broken world, a needing world. So, I mean, I don't know how to get through this conversation, because we're starting with a foundation that does not come across as a message of love, but of a big bully. So,
well, shouldn't we at least define the parameters of that before we begin? Because what I've found and what I've spent perhaps more time speaking on than anything else is when we read God is love, what we're typically doing is saying, okay, I know what love is, so that's what God is like. And that's the opposite of what it's saying. What it's saying is God is the one who defines love. You don't come to God with your understanding of love and make him like that. You look at God in order to define what love is. Because the very psalm that Ray quoted when it speaks about God's love, everlasting grace, everlasting righteousness, lasts forever, it's the same psalm that says he chased Pharaoh into the sea, he brutally murdered people, he brought things to an end, and the congregation are meant to respond, this is because of his love. And I see this in culture today, especially in politics. And I keep thinking, my response is always the same. Hold on. You don't get to define love. And then when someone else disagrees with your definition, you get to accuse them of being loveless. And so I think with Hollywood and literature over the past few decades, we've been sold the wrong concept of it to begin with. But then we read God as love, and then we make him like that. And that's putting the cart before the horse. He has to be the one. It's not, love is not God. Love is not God. God is love.
Yeah. And I get that. And certainly God defines what that means.
Right.
But when people hear the message and it comes to them, in my experience, people have not heard a message that says you are already on your way to either fall off a cliff or you are in the process of the free fall into this, abyss that is called death. And God has sent a rider on a white horse to be your savior, to save you from death. That is not the message people are getting. They're getting the message that God is about to do something to you if you don't blah, 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 blah. That's the way it's coming across. So I try to convince people the gospel, the good news is the consequences of sin that are bearing upon your life and bringing you into this, terrible sort of life in your heart and your relationships, and also have an end that is not the glory that God wants for you. Jesus came to save you from that. That's the message of the gospel. And I'm trying to turn around this sort of train that puts up a wall for people. They don't want, not everybody, I say they, I'm generalizing, I'm sorry. I'm saying those who have been given this message of God as a big bully, who's saying, you better do this or else, they're the ones that this is what they're hearing. This is what they're hearing in all of this kind of what do we call it? Evangelical kind of, and fire and brimstone sort of sermons. And that has to be overcome. And that narrative needs to shift. God came to save us. He sent a rider on a white horse to save us from sin and death. And this is the gospel, and this communicates love. Best I can tell.
I'm okay with being the dumbest person in the room. And I think that's clear that I'm probably the dumbest person in the room here. I'm not too sure what we're talking about here. Ray said something at the beginning there. Billy bounced back and seemed to have something that he was saying coming from the world's point of view of the world defining what love is. Randy, appreciate what you're saying here about the messages that people are hearing from the pulpit. It's not the message that you're communicating from the pulpit. And we're trying to talk about God's love. Yes. So help me understand, because it seemed, I don't know if we're going in the same direction or not, or are we talking about what Ray, and I don't think what Billy kind of said, he's got his own agenda there, if we heard him correctly, and is not really listening to what Ray said. And then Randy seems to have something else going on from the direction of a pulpit. So I'm the dumbest person in the room. So can someone give me a question of what we're actually talking about. Because if it's what Randy's talking about, then I think that might be a helpful discussion. If we want to circle it to what Billy's saying, and let's talk about the world and what the world viewing love is, I've no interest in doing that, because they don't define love for us. We do it from the scriptures, and if we want to try and I don't know if Randy and Ray are connected, and Billy's the odd one out. Someone help me.
Well,
I'll go ahead and jump back. I'll go ahead, since it was my topic
go.
suggested,
All right.
and I'm the one that succinctly presented why I suggested it. To get back to my 3 points, if that might be useful, because I think, not to hijack Billy, I mean, it's his class and his Zoom class. So, but when I posed the questions or made the statements that to consider the central truths that God is love and connection with, what are the ramifications for me as an individual that that's true, and then as a church, and then in terms of our approach to evangelism. Billy, in all your years, Billy M, as a preacher and working with the Three Chopped and other churches, perhaps, have you ever asked any of your church members, your congregants, have they ever thought about themselves in terms of someone saying, for instance, what's your wife's name, Billy? Your wife's first name?
Melissa?
Melissa?
Yep.
So what's it sound like to say Melissa is love? And is that something that we would say of Melissa, that she would think of herself in that way, or yourself, Billy? Billy is love. What would that mean exactly? Would it mean the same things we say when God is love? When we say the Three Chopped Church, could you have that as a motto in your bulletin, your brochures, maybe your website? Three Chopped Church is love. Are
you asking how's that love displayed, Ray?
Yeah. How's it seen? Basically, okay. Yes. How is it displayed? How do we, since God is love and we're his followers, it's called to be like him, and through faith in Christ and the mediation of the Holy Spirit, we're enabled to become more like him. So I think God's intent for us is that we become love in the same way he is, as much as humanly possible. What would that mean for us to say Billy Wilson is love, the house church in Tucson is love? And how do we go about evangelizing? Then a third question, if you want to get into it, how does that change what we say when we're talking to someone about God or Jesus?
So how's that love displayed? How's that love seen through us? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Okay.
How do we go about making it or causing it to be true that we are love in a similar way God is love?
Okay.
Right, but my point was that we can't even begin to discuss that unless we're allowing God to define the word and not Hollywood.
Yeah, which is a really good point, Billy, I think. A really good point.
Yeah, but I've no interest in listening to what Hollywood says love is. So my automatic response is God defines my love, because I'm a preacher.
Yeah,
I'm not going to say, yeah. So I have no interest even to discuss what Hollywood thinks love is.
Well, maybe it's just me, because when I listen to the vast bulk of even preachers speak about love, it sounds more like Hollywood than it does scripture.
And that's a good point to bring up then. So let's discuss, and I think what Randy said is connected to what Ray said. What are we hearing from the pulpits? But I wouldn't even entertain that. I would want to entertain, what are you hearing from my pulpit that's not reflecting God's love? Now, I don't get to listen to you, all you preach. I can just share about, this is what I believe I'm sharing from my pulpit. And does that sound like it's loving? Because I think I heard Randy say what he hears from the pulpits is, if you don't do X, Y, and Z, God's going to burn you forever. I don't believe for a second that that's what I would hear Randy preach. So I've no real interest then in what these other people are going to communicate. I'm more interested in trying to fire up Randy. and hearing what he has to say, or Darren or Roger or you, Billy, or myself. You know what I'm saying? So I'm trying to, and I'm the dumbest person in the room. So, you know, what direction are we going to go here
So
in the conversation?
my comment, so what I had to say was kind of bipolar, because one side of it was, as was said, the implication of the evangelism. I know there's a communication like breakdown. People are not hearing that God is love. That's just not what they're left with. So that's why I brought that up. The other side of the problem for me is, from our own heritage, we're so focused on performance and things like this, that trying to put into practice like Romans, 13, because in many places, like in John 15, Jesus says, you know, here's my command. If you love me, you'll do what I'm saying. And here's what I'm saying: you should love one another. There it is right there. And then over and over in Galatians, and I think 2 John, several places over and over, it says love is the fulfillment of the law. Okay, so this whole law thing. In Romans 13, it goes so far that Paul says that in the way that love fulfills the law, if there is, you know, any law like, you know, don't commit murder and don't commit adultery and honor your father and mother. And then he says, and if there's any other law or any other command, all of them are fulfilled in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. And what I'm saying is, so that is so broad as to be sort of for me, in tension with a lot of the rules. A lot of the rules. I mean, we have a lot of rules that we've made. And so this really, it really becomes, you know, a conundrum for me. Can I really preach that the point of everything, all law, was to bring us to a point where we love like God loves? Can we preach that? And what are the implications of that for the church? Because it has a whole bunch of rules. So these are the things I've struggled with when I thought about how to talk about love. So there's where I'm at. We're not giving a good gospel message of love, and we're so burdened down with rules that it makes it look ridiculous. Paul could say any rule is summed up in this one: love your neighbor. So that's what I'm struggling with.
So how do we create that culture, and how do we cause or enable it to where, when someone thinks of Billy and Melissa and their family, you know, the McGuigan family is love. The Three Chop Church Road is love, because they so faithfully reflect the love of God. How do we get to that point where we can approach that individually, familially, congregationally, to if the central truth about God is love, and we want to be said of us that we're love? How do we get there?
My point was maybe a lot less time spent on speaking about love. Love doesn't define love. Love doesn't define God. God defines love. Therefore, preaching on God does the job. That's my point. The focus on Him automatically takes care of everything else. You can speak about love all day and still maybe not even have said much about God. All you've done is define the word.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you spoke about God, you've de facto described and defined love just by presenting Him in what He does, how He acts, how He feels, what He thinks. And then that shapes what people understand the word to mean.
But what if you focus on God at the Mount Sinai when He's coming down, when Moses is coming down and the people are, you know, doing the golden calf thing? You can focus on that and say, this is God, but you're not communicating the cross. You know, you can focus, like, what about the God who maintains His covenant with Abraham, even though Abraham left the land and is now in Egypt lying about his wife? Like, there's a God who's faithful to His covenant while Abraham's a mess. Why does Abraham get a pass and the people with the golden calf don't? Or you can, that's what I'm saying is I don't think we've focused enough on, and this is, I guess, for the preachers, I don't think we focus enough on the moment. I think I brought this up to Billy before. The moment that Jesus is dealing with a sinful woman, before he ever tells her anything about changing her life, and while it's clear she's been caught in the very act and living in this lifestyle, before any of that, after all that, and before ever saying anything about changing or talking to her about faith, Jesus says to her, "Where are your accusers? Is there no one to condemn you?" These are the people rightly following the law, ready to stone her. Of course, they weren't very rightly following the law because they were conspirators, but the law said they could, take this action. And Jesus interrupts it, and his words to her are, "Neither do I condemn you." And I think the church needs to find itself not losing anything else about Jesus, not losing anything else about God, but with the capacity to be in the very same situation with sinners who are clearly sinners, and those sinners feeling our compassion and that we're not condemning them. If we could get there, I think we'd be on the road to communicating the love of God. And this is consistent with Jesus, and it doesn't negate him turning over tables or saying brood of vipers. It's just, it's looking at the person. It's not rule-based, it's context-based and person-based. And he's trying to communicate love to this woman who's been defeated not only by her own choices, but by a culture that is ready to stone her. So.
And your two examples, Randy, I think fit in well with what Billy was saying. If we teach God and emphasize God and quit talking about ourselves and our own concepts, that's helpful, because there was a way to talk about the story of the golden calf, which emphasizes one face of God's love, his personal response to the golden calf in that whole episode, as well as Jesus' response to the woman taken in adultery. If we approach those stories, I think, with the right view and teach the right things from them, what God aims and would like for us to get from those stories, then we're presenting a God of love. And so I think that's connected with what Billy was saying as well. But again, in terms of disconnect, how many of you honestly, over all the years you've been preaching and you've been aware of the verse God's love, how many times have you connected that person to yourself and thinking, I need to live my life in such a way, when people think of Ray McClendon, I think Ray is love, or Ray's family is love, or Ray's church specifically like that. How many times, because I've spent years, that occurred to me a couple of years ago in my own study on love. And it's not really something I've ever heard before in my entire life in lesson anywhere. All the lectures I've been to, Abilene, Pepperdine, or Portland, all the sermons, all the meetings I've been to, I've never really heard that a single time put in that way. And I think it's of first importance that maybe we start thinking in that way. So,
Absolutely.
I think one of the things that I've heard it said several times, and I think it's biblical, but I don't think we do it enough, is we do talk a lot about God and about love, but to actually just see Jesus, which is what you're talking about, Scott McKnight has his students do. He sends them through the Gospels so that they might see Jesus. And by seeing Jesus, like Billy was saying, we do get a definition of what love is. We don't, I guess that's the thing I don't think we do very well, is we talk a lot about Jesus, but to just show Jesus. It's part of our tradition in that we have the Lord's Supper, and we claim in that Lord's Supper that we're coming again to see Jesus, as if it's a dramatic presentation of who Jesus is and what Jesus has done. And it hasn't been, we haven't done it. I don't think we've done a great job of using that as a good storytelling device as we should. I also think that we haven't done a great job of just like I said, just seeing Jesus, marveling at Jesus. And whenever we talk about defining love, we're never just given a a specific statement, we're told to just see Jesus. I'm looking at 1 John chapter 4, verse 10. This is love, not that we love God, and he tells a story that we know, that he loved us and sent his son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. And so I'm like, well, okay, what does that mean? Well, I can, as a preacher, I can dwindle that down to some sort of summary statement that I make about it. But inevitably, you just got to face the story of who Jesus is and what Jesus has done in order to define love. You've just got to live in that story. Another thing I love about, and then talk about how that translates with us, in John chapter 1, verse 18, it says, no one has ever seen God, but God, the only Son who is from the Father's side, has made him known. And a great connection to that is in 1 John chapter 4, verse 12, no one has ever seen God. But if we love one another, God lives in us and his love is made complete in us. So he is a visual representation of God. Now we are a visual representation of God.
Right.
And we have to see Jesus and to be Jesus. And I don't know if we can summarize, I don't know if we can dwindle that down into a set of propositions or anything. We just have to keep looking at Jesus and we have to keep acting like Jesus. And somehow that's supposed to work itself out and be the world's definition of love by watching. One of the, I've learned to almost call it a view of atonement in my mind. There's the sacrificial view of atonement.
Darren, may I interrupt you real quick before you go off on that? Because what you just said is so important. I wanted to linger just a couple seconds on that. And I wasn't looking for a bunch of propositions at all, because I understand these Zoom meetings that we're going to do once a month to be just basically a conversation between like minds so that we can make some forward progress on any topic we choose to approach. I love the way you kept emphasizing seeing Jesus. And where is that text exactly that says, sir, we would see Jesus? This old gospel preacher in the non-institutional side of the brotherhood was at Garden Grove in Fairview for, I think, close to 40 years. He had a little plaque made up and he had it nailed to the inside edge of his pulpit. Only he could see it. The audience couldn't see it. And every time he got up in the pulpit to preach a sermon, he looked down and read the plaque. And the plaque simply was a quote, sir, we would see Jesus.
That's all.
And if we all had that in our pulpits, and our goal was to help the church to see God, to see Jesus, as the quote from the New Testament there. Never forgotten that.
Man, that's a wonderful thing. I think they need to not just hear what we have to say about Jesus, and they obviously need to see we would all recognize a preacher needs to be seen with a Jesus life. They need to see us in front of them responding to Jesus. They need to see us responding in marvel. They need to see us responding as if, wow, I can't believe I'm loved this much.
Yeah.
They need to see that from us so that they know, hey, I'm not just preaching about something you ought to get up here, but this is something that's changed my life. One of my favorite places for that, talk about the communion. I don't know if you guys have ever read Robert Richardson's Communings in the Sanctuary. Robert Richardson was Alexander Campbell's Alexander Campbell mentored him. And it's the most beautiful piece of devotional literature that the Restoration churches have produced in my mind. But they're his Lord's Supper talks that he compiled. And I love reading those, because as you're reading those, and I can't imagine what it was like to actually watch him present these. But as you're reading those, you're just like, this guy absolutely adores Jesus and marvels at Jesus and is just astounded by what Jesus has done. And that's what they need to see from us. That's what they need to hear from us as ministers, that we are astounded by what we have seen. And then obviously they need to see us formed into Jesus as well. But we've used that word several times, display. How do we know what love is? What is, like Billy was saying about his wife, what does Melissa display? That's what we need to see. We just need to see Jesus.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's where Scott gets it right, sending his boys to the gospel. We're just about, it doesn't take a genius to see how quickly life gets complicated. We're just about to adopt our second little boy. He's only 3. But very quickly, he kept running back to me. Daddy, Will is doing this. Daddy, Will is doing that. Daddy, Will just did this. Daddy, Will. And so most of you know me by now. I'm I'll suck it up, wee man. Away you go. And then eventually I had to have the conversation on tattletaling. Look, if you keep treating Will like this, Will's not going to want to play with you. And I don't really want to hear everything that Will is doing. Stop tattletaling. And then there was a moment, it was over on that sofa. There was a moment where I saw the pennies drop. It's not good to tattletale. And off he went. And I'm thinking, I did a good job there. And then I thought, oh, wait a minute. John, come here. And John come over and I said, unless it's really, really bad. And you gotta qualify. So Randy's point, in John 8, brilliant. What does love look like? Oh, it's there. But when McKnight sends his people back to the full revelation of Jesus, then they have to conclude in John chapter 2 with a whip in his hand and over. Oh, that's what love looks like too.
Yes.
And when he's screaming, "Woe to you, Pharisees!" Love looks like that as well. Oh,
yes.
All right. So it's back in the old days, the fire and brimstone. Although I disagree with eternal punishing, they weren't wrong to warn people. Warning can be loving. But if that's all there is, and they never got to John 8, there's a major malfunction. What I think is a lot of us are in John 8 and we're, maybe we want to be perceived as huggers. And to the extent of we don't even warn people anymore, we're happy for them to fall off a cliff, just so long as no one thinks bad about us. And
Do you think
and the McKnight thing, get them into the Gospels, let them see how love expresses itself in a multi-varied life.
Yeah, balance will always be important.
Do you think it's amazing that we have these tirades of Jesus about those who probably kept the rules in a way better than anybody, while at the same time, the sinners seem to be happy to hang around Jesus? Now, it doesn't mean that Jesus wouldn't have something to say about sin, but somehow, whatever he had to say about it still drew sinners to him.
Jesus was tougher on sin than they were.
Yes, but somehow the people received it in love.
Yeah.
So that's seeing Jesus. That we've got to be able to see that stuff. And and I think we do know some people who are able to do that. But we have to understand, this is not, if we're thinking about people and how to bring the gospel of love to them, we have to know they're not hearing that. These are nuances that they're not getting enough of. And so I'm happy that we're talking about it, because maybe we can spur each other on to make sure that this is what we communicate, or help others communicate.
You keep saying, Randy, we're not hearing that, right? And so I want to lean back on you a little bit, because I know you a little bit, and I've seen you and Jill at Pepperdine and whatnot, and I've heard stories from Billy about the kind of people you are. And what I've personally
Sorry.
experienced is that you're very gentle and kind and loving and caring. Both you and Jill, when I've met you and seen you at Pepperdine, and how you live your life. And I would believe then that is communicated from the pulpit.
Of course.
But-
Well, not
right.
anymore.
Well, I
left.
know not anymore, but
Yeah.
and so when you're saying people, they are not hearing that,
Yes.
I want to say, I don't care about what your neighbor preacher's doing, because of no influence over him. And so,
Yeah.
and maybe I'm just a little bit confused still.
Well,
because what I heard Ray say after he qualified or kind of cleared up the question is, how do people see God's love in me? And through Melissa, how's it displayed, and however Ray worded that. But when it comes to you, I don't know, Darren, I've never met him. I don't know how he lives his life, but the rest of you, I know and have been around you. You're communicating God's love. You're not going to do it perfectly. And so I see it in God's love through you and Jill and how you've interacted with me and spurred me on and encouraged me and just shared life and with those other guys too. So you're not doing it perfectly, but we see it in different ways where
Yes.
Billy's had to come to me and say, and I don't think Roger's done it yet, has to speak pretty strongly to me, but he does it because he loves me, or I've had to do it with him. So I see it happening.
Yeah, Billy, maybe I should apologize. I have a group like of 7,000 people. It's a Church of Christ group that I started like 10 years ago. But I have these constant conversations with preachers and those who are dyed in the wool and sort of it's, probably a little bit more traditional mainstream. And so these things are always in my frustration. And
Yes.
So I apologize if
You don't need to apologize. No, you don't.
That's where it's coming from.
Of course. And I get that. And we could spend our time discussing those other people.
Yeah. And I don't need to do that.
Aren't communicating, God is love because maybe I got this from Billy Wilson or somebody else. It's raining outside and people want to come in from the rain and they come into the church and the preacher gives them more rain, and so it's then the preacher then doesn't have a clue about God's love, because I think the pulpit shapes the church and the messages coming out of the pulpit are shaping the church. I could be wrong on that. Lean back on me a little bit, but anyway, you don't need to apologize. We're all hearing things like that, but I don't care to listen to that. I've got 5 guys in front of me that I'm trying to encourage to keep doing what you're doing. And I might be off on this or very lopsided, and I don't mean to keep coming after you, Randy, but you're speaking that way. And I didn't explain myself at the end there, right? Mute.
Well, I appreciate your words.
Billy M., let me just ask you, do you think how you've been at Three Chopped Road, and of course I know what kind of lovely and loving preaching they're getting from you, but do you think it's common knowledge or common perception among your congregation that the people look at themselves and as individuals and familially, but congregationally, specifically in the context of, as a congregation, we are love in the same way we mean when we say God is love, or the family. Do they think of themselves in that way? And that was why I thought it might be important for us to discuss it, just to help us all make it to where the people that we know and the Christians we know and love, we work with in our churches and our families and in our sphere of influence, to where they identify with the love of God and how God is calling us to be people of love in the same way that he is. So it can be said that, Ray McClendon is love, and the Petaluma Church of Christ is love, which we have so much work to do in that regard. But that's the real connection I was kind of getting after with suggesting this to begin with. So you think that's valid, or
I think as people look at me, they see a flawed human who's trying to reflect the image and love of God. And if they're around me and Melissa behind closed doors, they're going to say, those two don't reflect God's love. Because I'm human, right? Me and Melissa can fight, or I can, tell the kids off that they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing with a tone. But publicly, people are going to say of me and Melissa, and even my three kids, those guys are trying to reflect God's love. And my neighbors would say it too. They're lovely people, and we know they're Christians and da. It's the behind the closed doors part that every one of us here deals with, because we're not going to do it. Or I may not speak to one of the members in a kind way, and they may say, well, he doesn't really reflect God's love. But that person could be a complete jerk, and was a jerk to me. And my, my knee-jerk reaction is to, not all the time, but, so I think on a whole, and I think those of you who know me would say the same thing about me, that he does not try his best, but he does reflect God's love, and so does his family.
you
I
think
Roger's going to say something there.
you think our churches think of themselves as expressions of God's love? I mean, we've been saying and quoting the scripture, God is love. How many times in our lives have we heard that said as of our friends or colleagues or fellow Christians or our actual churches, that we are love in the same vein? It's just something that I've never really heard throughout my life at all. So I maybe wonder, we're familiar with the concepts as you describe it, Billy, very much so in a generalized way. But have we really thought of it in terms of God is love and this church is love, meaning the same thing and going in the same direction that the scripture does?
Well, I think what I was saying, especially considering your background, Ray, and what Randy was commenting on, I think my point was more, I really think we're doing a better job than we used to, but I think we're allowing Hollywood to define the word now, and that's a problem. I think every conversation has to be coming from the hill that you're standing on. You can only comment on what you're seeing, which is why Randy, when he explained why he was saying what he was saying, was surrounded by 7,000 people who, dear God, well, let's forget about them. But so there has to be some of this, hey, what are you hearing? What are you seeing? In order for us to be able to fix it. I heard someone say one time, but I can't remember the dates. Back in the 1800s, everybody was talking about God. No one was talking about Jesus. Then by 1870, everybody started writing about Jesus, because maybe they weren't writing about Jesus because it was a given. Maybe they already knew, and everybody started writing to try and address the balance, because from where they were standing, that was the thing that was out of balance. And no one was speaking about the Spirit. Maybe no one was speaking about the Spirit because they all knew it. They all knew him. They all knew it. They knew the parts. They knew the verses. They knew the text. And so what we see is not an overabundance of expression, but rather an effort from the scholars of the time to bring balance to what was being perceived from their particular hill.
Well, that's very true. I must confess that, because you've heard me say before that I kind of grew up in the Taliban wing of the Churches of Christ, but one of the very first people that I ever because it was the first person who wasn't from that part of the Churches of Christ that I saw a book in the library of one of the preachers of my congregation growing up, was Billy's uncle, Jim McGuigan. And so the first couple of books of his that I bought and read was the first preacher really in my entire life up until, going into my early 20s, that wrote the way he did, that was kind and loving and gentle and humble. And it just overwhelmed me because it was the first time I'd really heard someone that wasn't thundering fire and brimstone all the time and talking about how bad everyone else was, and even bad the other Churches of Christ was, and they didn't agree with us right down the line, etc. And he's the one that initially pointed me in all these kind of newer directions I've been in since then. So, and of course I see so many of the same traits and qualities mirrored in Billy, and is one of the reasons I love and appreciate you so much, Billy, is that you exude those same qualities such a great way.
Sorry for laughing.
Much more so than Billy Wilson, as a matter of fact.
Oh, well, that's a given. Sorry for laughing, but the Taliban wing of the church gets me every time. And then I saw Billy changing his name to not Taliban Church.
I think Roger's going to say something.
Well, at the risk of running us down another rabbit hole, which I don't want to do, because this has been fruitful discussion and points to ponder. I've been sitting here and I've been thinking about, how we display the love of Jesus. And as I think about that, I think too, several of the things that have been said, we look at Jesus and it's obvious, and I appreciate, Randy for bringing this up. It's obvious that, you see Jesus loving, a good demonstration of love with the woman caught in adultery. But it's harder to see when he's running the money changers out of the temple. And yet that's a loving thing too. It's harder to see when he's dealing with Judas after he's washed the disciples' feet and he says, hey, what you do quickly. And I think there's something even loving in that, but it's a little harder to see. And so I'm thinking about, as we've talked about, how we display this to people. Do people see us as loving? Do people see our church as loving like Jesus did? And in the background of that, I think about the experiences that I've had in my life when people demonstrated that love of Jesus to me. I think of how God describes us, and when we were enemies, it says God demonstrated his love for us in sending his son. We were very much the woman at the well. We've probably been the scribes and the Pharisees too. We've probably been the money changers in the temple. God's probably had to deal with us lovingly in a lot of different ways. But I'm thankful today, and I think of times in my life when people have reflected the love of Christ to me. And that probably has helped me see it in a variety of ways as much as anything else, if that makes any sense. And I know these are very personal experiences if we were to call to mind in our own lives when people have reflected the love of Jesus to us. And they would be moments in our undoneness, when we were the woman caught in adultery or the money changers in the temple or whichever. But I think it might be healthy for us today. If we're going to think of how we display that love to other people, it might be healthy for us as well to think of how people have displayed it to us. Because those are some of the moments that bring it home to me, if that makes any sense. And again, I'm probably at the risk of running us down another rabbit hole that I don't necessarily want us to run down. I think it would be helpful and healthy to us to see when people have really displayed that to us. So that's the thought that's going on in my mind.
I don't think it's a rabbit hole. I'm just trying to say that sheep don't only gather around the shepherd because he helps them when they're wounded and feeds them. They gather around the shepherd when the wolves arrive. And I think sometimes the danger of presenting a shepherd who can only hug and feed when people are saying, I don't need a hug. There's wolves all around me. It's not a hug I need. It's real help, real deliverance. I don't need a hug. I need saved. Then, you know, maybe the churches would be attracting more people if we presented a shepherd that could handle the wolves as well as the lambs. And it has to be both. Some of us need a hug. And John 8 says, I got all the hugs in the world. I don't care what kind of trouble you're in. But John 8 also says, oh, and I'll handle the wolves.
Yeah.
I'll handle the wolves. I guarantee you, you come to me and their rocks will hit the ground quicker than you can think.
Hmm.
And even if we secluded it to John 8, from what I can hear, 90% of the preaching, maybe even more than that, is centered around heart, and perhaps rightly so. But very little is ever said about the wolves all scampering away.
You know, I dealt with a lady one time who was the epitome of major depressive disorder. If there were pictures in the DSM-5, her face would be there. But she said something very profound to me in the midst of her depression and in the midst of her suffering. She said, I believe in God. I know he's there, but sometimes I just need him to have a little skin on him. You know,
Right.
she's talking about, I need him in the form of a hug. I need him in the form of being real and taking the rocks out of the wolf's hands. I need him to be, you know, a real and upfront presence in my life. And I think that's why this conversation is so important, because sometimes we are that skin. We are that ability to be that hug for someone who needs it. We are that ability to be that one who can help protect them or tell them what they need to hear when they desperately need to hear it. And so that has always stuck with me, how that lady said to me in the midst of her suffering, I believe in God, but sometimes I just need him to have some skin on him. And man, we've got to become that skin of God in trying to display and reenact God's love in the world that desperately so badly needs it. You
So
know?
I think I have something productive to say
Good
about
deal.
that. And I think it ties in with what Billy Wilson and also Billy McGuigan were bringing up about how we can be more productive in what we're doing and also deal with these wolves that Billy says what people need to see. So Billy McGuigan was saying about how he is present in those around him, and they would see Jesus to whatever extent, you know, they know he's trying, but maybe not as much in the home, you know, in that place. And Jill and I don't follow our example, but we were probably way more real than most, at least this is my impression, most preachers. We did not buy into trying to live a plastic life or try to hide anything. And I'm not saying anybody does that. That's not what I mean. I just mean that's what I remember. We were often a little bit too comfortable. But what I found was, and I think I preached this as in the last couple of years in trying to get this across to people, and that is that God's love, God's presence, his grace is, God can be glorified. This is what I want to say. God can be glorified even in our sin. And don't get mad at me for saying that. I don't mean by our sin. I don't mean when we sin in our sinning. But we are sinners, and so are those people, those sheep that need to see a shepherd. And God can be glorified when those who are trying to represent Jesus are very clear about their own brokenness and their own reception of that grace. Because some of the wolves are the wolves tearing at people's hearts with the idea that they're still guilty of their sin.
Right.
And so ministers have a unique opportunity to be vulnerable and to be open and broken and being in the process of being sanctified, but not there yet. And I think I think congregations need to see this sort of humility and brokenness and leaning on the shepherd in us more than anybody in order for them to truly see Jesus and what he is to them. So that.
Yeah, I mean, when Paul writes to Rome and he says, look, are you despising the riches of God's grace? Don't you understand that his kindness is meant to bring about repentance?
Yes. Right.
If you had said to Paul, wait a minute, God's kindness is meant to bring about repentance, Paul would have probably responded by saying, yeah. And if you had said, yeah, but so did 40 days and Nineveh will be destroyed, that brought about repentance too. Paul would have probably responded, I don't want to speak for Paul, but Paul would have probably responded by saying, yeah, you don't understand the word kind. 40 days and Nineveh will be destroyed is kind.
You
That
know,
reminds me of one of my favorite stories in Mark chapter 10, where he doesn't call him a rich young ruler in this one, but we know him as the rich young ruler, who comes to Jesus and, says, I've kept all the commandments since I was a boy. And that's one of my favorite statements in the gospel, where it says, Jesus looked at him and loved him and then said, you got one more thing. And that to me is just one of the most amazing verses in the whole gospel, is just to hear him. He's about to voice something that he's pretty sure this guy is not going to do, I'm sure. And yet he says it to him because it is precisely because he loves him that he does that. I find that an amazing verse.
But that's the problem with God, right? There's always one more thing. there's always wait a minute, let me qualify the tattletaling.
I wouldn't mind. I know this. I trust all of you that you're have a relationship with Jesus. One thing I think that we ought to do more is just sit around with our congregations and just talk about Jesus. Learn to just, hey, tell me what makes you love Jesus, or tell me what makes you feel loved by Jesus. And we ought to have those kind of conversations with one another that are very personal. I share with you one of my favorite verses. I love when he goes to, you talk about the helping a person, the woman helping. One of my favorite verses is when there's that woman who has the crippled, she's been over so much that she can barely walk. And it's the Sabbath day, and everybody's wondering, well, what's he going to do on the Sabbath day? And of course, he heals her, as he does. But one of my favorite statements that he makes is basically, you guys would pull your donkeys out of a ditch. Shouldn't I do the same thing for this woman who is a child of Abraham? What an amazing statement that he doesn't just heal her, but he says, she's one of us. How long has it been since how long has it been since she's felt like one of them? And he just with a word is saying, no, this is a daughter of Abraham. That's a beautiful statement.
Yeah, it is.
Hey.
Fellas, I need to run. I've got to go pick up my little angel with her broken wing early from daycare today. So I thought I'd make one more point. I know how important it is, but I sense that it is. We talk about the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And probably when you've talked about that before, you've emphasized the fact that really that entire text is really about the love of God, because every single one of those things is just another face of love. There are different expressions of love. There are different ways love manifests itself, but at the end of the day, they're all faces of God's love. What Paul says in the Corinthian letter about love does not take into account a wrong suffered. Love is patient, love is kind, and et cetera, et cetera. It's human nature, and someone said this also years ago, I've never forgotten it. It's human nature to tend toward extremes. We all nearly tend toward extremes. And the illustration he gave was that it's like a pendulum we're all clinging to, and we're clinging for dear life when the pendulum is moving fastest, right over the center. And then when it gets to either end and it slows to a stop just before it reverses direction, we hop off on this side because it's easy, or we wait till it gets to the other side, slows to us just before it reverses direction, slows to, and we hop off. And I've seen that in my life, that we as preachers and teachers tend towards extremes. You've got the hellfire and brimstoners and the ones that want to emphasize, scaring people into the baptistry, and then you've got those that talk about love all the time. And I get as what Billy's been saying throughout this, the emphasis that balance is really kind of hard. Balance is supremely important, but it's difficult. It's easier to talk about the fruit of the Spirit and the 1 Corinthians expressions of love than it is about, I think it was celebrating the wrath of God, the dark line in the face of God. It's easier to talk about those things. It's a little more, not just satisfying, but it's easier and it's more pleasant, I guess, what I'm looking for. But we have to understand that we need to be centrist, and we need to really, really balance and talk about the golden calf and the redemptive chastisement and the punishment of God and all the things that he was willing to do in the Old Testament to his own people, and et cetera, and all the places in the Gospels that Billy mentioned, the driving from the temple with a scourge and overturning the tables, et cetera. Balance is so important, and we need to strive for that too, because this too is the love of God. And I guess that's will always be a big challenge for us, speaking of one as much as the other, so that people in our teaching and preaching and in our conversations will know that this is every bit as much the love of God as the other is, even though we understand why it's easier and more pleasant to talk about, the warm fuzzy stuff more often. So I hope, I appreciate the discussion, guys. I appreciate each and every single one of you, and I hope you have a great week, and look forward to talking with you guys again next time on some other topic, and God bless you all.
Thanks for bringing the topic up, Ray, for us to discuss.
And
Thank you.
You're not the dumbest one in the room, Billy.
Okay,
We'll see you guys. Take care. I love you all. Bye-bye.
thanks, Ray.
I wonder, I'd like to pick up on what Ray says and tie it into what Darren said. Because I'm sitting here wondering why all of a sudden this movement towards the hugs and cuddles side of love. And it occurred to me, when we work around the homeless here in Tucson, I remember my first time with them. These are very different than homeless in Scotland, and I'll explain why. When we worked around the homeless in Scotland, sometimes I would say to these people, what got you into a situation like this? Waiting for some disaster story. And quite a lot of them, I would estimate maybe 25% of them would say, nothing. We choose it. Now, they choose it in Tucson because it's warm. That's why I say no one would ever choose it in Scotland. It's too cold to choose that in Scotland. But they choose it down here, and they follow the weather. And I thought, oh, you want to be homeless? Oh, yeah. They wouldn't take a house from you if you offered it. And then there's another 25% of people, I'm guessing here, that could get back on their feet if someone would give them help. They're more than capable of doing it. They've just had genuine, seriously bad breaks, and now they need a leg up, and they could handle it from there. And then there's about, what does that leave, 50% of the people that you could buy them a house in Beverly Hills and give them $1 million and they'd be homeless next week. That's why government is useless in these people. You can't legislate friendship. These people need friends. The wolves, their wolves need genuine, they need to be genuinely met. And this is why it ties in with what Darren's been saying with well, how do people see this? And ties in with what Aaron and Ray have been saying. Well, why all this emphasis from the nicer side? Maybe the emphasis is the nicer side because it's really easy just to hug people. So if that's what we make love out to be, then I'm really loving. But as soon as someone starts talking about, hey, this means taking someone into your house who's homeless and dealing with their wolves, then we're not overly happy with that. Maybe we're not much like some of our political friends that deal with the more affectionate side of love and the proclamation of it. Love people, love, but when it actually gets down to doing it, all they really do in politics is throw money at the situation. I wonder if we just do the same. These people have got to see, they really, it's a friend they need. Now, some of them don't even want a friend. They're just unhelpable. Because even if you took them in, they'd be gone in 10 minutes. But what I'm saying is there are people who genuinely are going to be, are going to need to be carried every step into the promised land. And I hear what you're saying, Darren. People need to see Christ in us, so we'll give them a sandwich. People need to see Christ in us, so we'll give them a hug. We won't condemn them. Can they see Christ in us carrying a lamb along the road? Will we actually carry one? Will we use it? Will our home genuinely be his home and used for the furtherance of the gospel? Will we actually deal with real wolves?
Oh, that's a great point, Billy. I guess two things, it brings that up. I think one of the most dangerous things that for our churches today is that we call ourselves loving because we are friendly to one another.
There you go.
And I found that to be very dangerous because it's more than friendliness, at least by the world's definition. Obviously, we're defining words again. It's introduce a person in there who's not easy to love. We'll test friendliness at that point,
Well, yeah, and it's not easy. It's not easy. It's dirty. In fact, in the 12 years, I think it's 12 years. Don't ask me dates. In the 12 years that Sarah and I have been here, we opened our house to a homeless guy for about 5 of those years, did everything in our power to help us. And I kept hoping I would prove Sarah right. I would prove Sarah wrong and that I was right and it would all be worth it. Wasn't. He's unhelpable. And it took me far too long. Now that little experience, and because I didn't deal with it right, has now left such a sour taste in the mouth of my wife. And God knows how many other people we could have helped if I had listened to her in the first place.
We've got a guy we're helping right now. He's a homeless guy that lives in the park, lives out of his car, and he's a massive hoarder. His car is packed is packed completely. It takes him 30 minutes to even get in the car because of all the trash and everything that he's got in his car. And so in my mind, the Christian thing to do is I'm going to clean that car out. I'm going to rescue him from his hoarding. But what I would be doing at that moment is a traumatic event in his life. And so I've spent a couple of afternoons and continue to do so. We just go over and very patiently unload very slowly. Oh, it's so slow. It drives me nuts. But we very slowly take something out and say, you really need this. And we put it aside, and it drives anybody crazy. But I know I want to be Jesus to him, not just a guy who cleans out his car. And so trying to trying to recognize how traumatic every little thing being thrown away is. And at the end of it, just saying, man, I know that was really tough on you. And I pray for him. I pray for him to say, hey, he's really going through some really difficult times right now. And I just want to, I just thank you for giving him the power to be able to throw something away, you know, but
Yeah.
trying to treat him, he has so many needs, it's unbelievable, but just trying to treat him, hey, you're a human being. And you're making choices like I have to make choices. And I just want to be there to help you if you got something difficult you need to do, and trying to treat him, you know, compassionately. And like I said, as a human being and not a project, you know.
Right. One of the greatest things I ever heard, Frank Worgan again, Billy. One of the greatest things I ever heard, and I'm not quoting him verbatim, because it was when I was back at Bible school 20 odd years ago, and I can't remember what I said yesterday, never mind what he said 20 years ago. But he did say words to the effect of, welcome to the Bible school. Here's what you're going to see. You're going to see a God who becomes to people what they need him to become.
Say that again.
You're going to see a God who becomes to people what they need him to become. This is why it cannot be limited to single passages or single instances. Even when we talk about the cleansing of the temple, we tend to talk as though God's having some hissy fit. He's not. That's love in action. That's him trying to save them.
I think that was the message of the shack. The God comes to you in a way you can accept him. I don't know how well that was received, but I think that was what they were
Right.
trying to get across.
And I think if we mimic that more, Darren, if we became to people, like Paul said, I became all things to all men. I think perhaps the church's problem is we became one thing to all men. The church, take it or leave it. And they've
Right.
left it. And they've left it. But becoming to people, like you said, Darren, there's no point cleaning his car. He doesn't want it. Now, he should want it, but he's not there yet. So you can only deal with the hand you're dealt, right? So that's what you do. And, you know, sometimes the lambs are going to need lifted. Sometimes the limbs are going to need bound. And sometimes the wolves are going to need chased.
I'm going to have to bounce in a little second, but I want to respond to a couple of things. I think sometimes we give being friendly a bad rap. I think we should be friendly toward people. I'm confident Jesus was friendly toward people, but it didn't leave it there. He must have, as it was referenced earlier on, you said it, Billy, he was harder on sin than the Pharisees were, but the people received it, and they received it in such a way because he was friendly toward them, and friendly might not be the right word there.
Well, that's the marvel. Yeah, that's the marvel.
Yeah, and so,
but he could be tougher on sin, and yet he didn't repel people.
Yeah, and so there must have been a friendliness about him where people were attracted to him. The sinners and the tax collectors were attracted to him.
Yes.
So there is something about a friendliness. And then, going to you're helping the homeless man, and I don't remember his name. You told me what it was before and whatnot. You did help him, and you did help him for 5 years. It may not have ended the way you wanted it to end, but you helped them. And so we should be friendly and help people, but not just, well, not that you were doing this or Sarah was doing this. We're going to help you as long as you become a Christian at the end of it. Now, you helped him in the moment he needed to be helped, and you threw out the seeds doing it. And then the last thing I'm saying is, Randy and Jill, your ministry was effective as it was, and the fruit of that will be seen for years and years because of how you two live your life. and speaking in that way in the pulpit and out of the pulpit, that we've no idea the influence, because you're real, and our pulpits need to be more real, and the people behind them need to be more real, and that needs to be balanced, of course. But you guys are effective because you've affected my life, and I can't be the only one. So all the years you've done ministry and still doing ministry, maybe not in the full-time thing, the influence, the ripple effects and the people, we've no idea. And it's exactly because you are real and saying, I need him as much as you do.
Yeah.
And that's why you guys are so powerful as a couple and effective in the ministry, because you're real, because too many of us are plastic.
All right, well, that's been an hour and a half, pretty much. And this is precisely what I wanted in this kind of meeting: balance, counterbalance, rabbit holes. Can't avoid rabbit holes. We love rabbit holes. God didn't want us to get down rabbit holes. He wouldn't have given us rabbits. So, you know, everything in balance and stuff. But I love it. I love hearing your opinions. I love hearing the perception of things from the hill that you're standing on, because that helps me confirm whether or not what I'm seeing is more widespread, or whether I've just got limited vision on such a thing and need to adjust what the things that I'm saying, because maybe I'm trying to address a major problem that isn't major, or maybe I'm thinking something's a minor problem and it's not. So it's good to hear everybody, you know, piping in.
Good, thank you, appreciate you.
Me too.
fellas.
Thank you, guys.
All right, give it a couple of days chewing it over, and if anyone's got something in mind that can produce more rabbit holes for us.
Are you going to ask these fellas to fill in for you?
Oh, yeah. Listen, Darren, Roger, Randy, I've got 5 weeks. I do a Tuesday night Zoom class. Randy already knows about this.